Welcome to this webinar discussion. My name is Sadiq Al-Wasabi. I am a senior fellow at the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies, and I'm honored to be moderating today's panel on understanding the Houthi detention strategy in Yemen from local control to global leverage. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing a concerning development, the Houthis' increasing use of enforced disappearance and detention. We will explore how they have expanded their detention practices to include local staff working in UN agencies and humanitarian organizations. Our discussion will examine the implication of humanitarian aid, peace initiatives, and regional stability in the wake of their FTO redesignation. The panel will address how these developments affect humanitarian organizations operating in Yemen and analyze potential paths forward for humanitarian access in Yemen. To discuss these issues, we have a panel of experts with deep knowledge of human rights, policy analysis, and peace building. Let me introduce Nico Jafarnia, who is Yemen and Bahrain researcher at Human Rights Watch, specializing in human rights violations, international law, and armed conflict investigations. We also have Bara Shayban, associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Bara is a prominent political analyst with extensive experience in counterterrorism policies and human rights in Yemen. And we also have Linda Al-Ubahi, Senior Political Affairs and Mediation Advisors at Peace Track Initiative. Linda is also peace building and mediation in Yemen. We will also be taking questions from audience. Feel free to share your questions in the chat box here. Welcome, Nico, Bara, and Linda. Thank you all for joining us. And before we proceed with discussion, I'd like to ask everyone to take a moment of silence to honor Ahmed Ba'alawi, a WFP staff member who died while in Houthi detention in Saada this week. Thank you, everyone. And let me start with you, Nico. From your research at Human Rights Watch, can you walk us through how the Houthis' detention strategy has evolved? Why do you think they have intensified their crackdown in recent months?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we have a few different theories, and we're not at the end of the day full-on political analysts, so there's only so much I can say from a human rights perspective. What I can clearly state is that there's nothing new about what the Houthis are doing. There's a massive escalation in what they're doing, but they have been detaining people in civil society and arbitrarily arresting, arbitrarily detaining, and forcibly disappearing people since they took over Sana'a in 2014. It's nothing new that they have suppressed freedom of speech and that they have used empty threats against people and accused people of wrongdoings and whatnot without any evidence base for it. And so what we're seeing now is a major escalation in a pattern that they already have been perpetrating for many years at this point. Obviously, when the arrest began on May 31st of last year, it was right around the time that there was a move to make the central bank move from Sana'a to Aden. And there was a question of, was this a way for them to try to force the banks to stop with that move and to ensure that money stayed in the central bank in Sana'a? But it's also coming in a context in which, the hostilities in Gaza have been ongoing or had been ongoing at that point for more than a year at that point, for nearly a year. And the Houthis during that time had gained a lot of regional support, and also people weren't paying as much attention to what they were doing domestically. They obviously recruited a lot of new fighters, including children in a lot of cases. And I think there's also a question of, is this just simply another stage of their crackdowns on civil society, on their crackdowns on international institutions, when that has already been something that they've done for many years? They already were putting increasing restrictions on civil society. They were putting increasing restrictions on the UN. They control a lot of data and information access to UN agencies, despite the fact that, these are major operations and usually UN agencies would have to do, data assessments themselves and be able to do things themselves, that the Houthis have just fully taken a lot of control over in their territories to begin with. So I think there's, I think a lot of other people are better posed to speak in some ways about the, what might have happened. I think there's a lot out there. I also think that there's also a lack of clarity as well. And even amongst the Houthis themselves, who are a divided group, it's not very simple and straightforward who exactly did what and why they might have done it. I think what we do know at this point is that dozens of UN staff, dozens of civil society staff members, dozens of activists, and so many others who are, such an integral thread of Yemeni society are now sitting in arbitrary detention and have been forcibly disappeared with no knowledge of, for most of them, their whereabouts, their conditions, etc. And the Houthis are not letting up on this clearly.
That's really insightful, Nico. Bara, you have worked closely on policy and security matters related to Yemen. Why do you think the Houthis are specifically targeting UN staff? Is this purely about political leverage, or is there deeper strategic motivation at play?
Thanks, Sadiq. I mean, I've been following the issue of Houthi using arbitrary detention as a form of intimidation, political leverage, literally from the beginning, from the moment they came into Sana'a. But I think, as Nico mentioned, what I believe in, there isn't one specific reason. What people need to understand about the Houthis is that you're dealing with literally a ghost system. So sometimes you would have gained favor with a Houthi official, but that doesn't guarantee your security. So sometimes if you have a UN agency who had already reached some form of understanding with one part of the Houthis, that doesn't mean that they have ensured the safety of their staff. The moment there is a new players, mainly Houthi supervisors, and the Houthis created this network of Houthi supervisors, literally like a ghost system. They don't interact with their real names. They usually try to avoid public interaction as much as possible. And then it depends on who's in charge. I have dealt with cases where sometimes we reach to senior Houthi leaders like Muhammad Ali al-Houthi, for example, and he say, "I don't have leverage. I can't speak to that specific individual." So it really depends on who's in charge and who is the head of the Houthi movement at that particular moment is listening to. The second thing is it's a form of intimidation. There are many at the mid-level and lower level Houthi members and Houthi supervisors who have gained a lot of money through blackmail and intimidation from families who try to seek information, try to get information, and then try to make either money. Sometimes they would coerce them into pressuring the other side to do a prisoners exchange. So it depends on really on the context at that specific moment. The third thing I think is there is a lot of details that the UN I think should have been more forthcoming since the beginning, since there was this kind of intimidation, harassment of their staff and employers, because we've all literally heard about the Houthis want to gain access, for example, of the data and information of WFP, for example. Since 2018 and 2019, the UN didn't come forward and say what was this arrangement and why and how the Houthis are going to deal with this sensitive data. If they don't get enough of what they feel is concession from the UN, they will intimidate them even further. And because they're actually, like Nico mentioned, the focus, the attention at the media level and the international level was about the horrific scenes that we were seeing in Gaza. no one was paying attention about what would happen in Yemen. No one would care about if 100 staff, 200, 300. It doesn't matter how many numbers you add, because the Houthis had thousands of detainees at one time. I literally knew two young journalists who were arbitrarily detained at the beginning of the conflict, and they put them in a weapon depot, knowing fully well that it's going to be targeted by the Saudi-led coalition. Tragically, they died. You didn't see that outrage from the international community. They work on that lack, on that distraction. They capitalize on it. So, in my opinion, there isn't one specific reason why they would do so, but because of the events that were happening in Gaza and how they were viewed as supportive of the people in Gaza, it was an easy scapegoat to frame that actually now they are targeting people for espionage. And there are many people who they have been on their crosshairs for some time. They showed my picture along with many of my friends and colleagues on their media channels and saying, do you see what's happening in Gaza? Those are the targets. Those are the people who they have been working with as spies and for doing espionage for many years. And the people who are now in our captivity are just the end of that network, or just part of the same network who we finally managed to capture. So yeah, I think. Unfortunately, we're going to see more of that happening because the Houthis got used to it. They got used to of doing exactly that without suffering any consequences.
Yeah, that's important point. And we will talk later about Houthis using espionage card. Linda, we know that women detainees often face additional layers of stigma and long-term marginalization. How does Peace Track Initiative work to document these cases and advocate for their release?
Thank you for having me. Before I start, or before I answer this question, I want us to take a moment and to picture something. Imagine you wake up ready to go to work, a humanitarian work, a work that saves lives, and you are dedicated, relentless. You operate under fear, and then one day you disappear. No real charge, no trial, no explanation, and you just gone. Now imagine you are a woman in a country like Yemen. Your disappearance is not just a tragedy, it's a scandal. So your family will carry the shame. Your name carries a stigma, and also, even if you are released as a woman, you are never truly free. So this is happening in a country in Yemen, and this is also the brutal reality of arbitrary detention. So we need to understand that detained women face not only detention, but also the lifelong stigma. And this is not a violation of their rights. It's an attack on their dignity and future. And to go back to this detention, I think that these detention are not random. They are not about security. And this is just a strategy, a tool of power, a tool of control, and also negotiation. So as Bara and Nico have said, there's two levels of this detention. We have the local level. Generally speaking, it's used to silence opposition. It's used to silence also journalists, activists, women human rights defenders, and also anyone who challenged Houthi authority. But also there is an international level to this detention. It's the bargaining tactic. So when the Houthi detain UN staff and humanitarian and aid workers, they forces international actors into negotiation, and also it allows Houthi to extract concessions and reinforce their victim narrative. So generally speaking, it's now a system, and a system that serves Houthi inside and outside political. It serves their agenda political agenda inside and outside Yemen. Now, the gender impact of detention. For men, detention is injustice, but for women, it's a social death. So we know that many of detained women never regain their place in the society once released. And this is more than a human rights violation, as I said. So if we go to our mission at Peace Track Initiative, this is not an isolated cases. Since 2018, we have been documented more than 172 cases of kidnapping, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and severe torture targeting women human rights defenders. Most of these violations have taken place in Houthi-controlled areas, but also we documented some sexual and gender-based violence cases against migrant and refugee women and children in government-controlled area. So this threat continues, and since May 2024, at least 7 women have been detained, and including 2 to 4 from UN staff, and 3 have been released, and the rest or others remain detained. And we have also, as Nico also will mention later, I guess, it's also their families. Their families, they are too afraid to speak out because of serious safety concerns. So what we are doing is not just advocacy, even though advocacy is important. We are providing these women with direct protection and assistance. We including financial aid, relocation support, legal referrals, and also psychological assistance. And we also continue our work to do statements to the UN Security Council, to the Human Rights Council, and also to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. We believe that this work must continue if we need women to be protected, but also we face a challenge because when we provide protection, it's on a case-by-case basis because we don't have the resources, to be honest, and we cannot do this alone. I think that we need sustained support, and we need that protecting women should not be an emergency response. It should be a guaranteed right. Yeah. So basically, this is it, and we need international commitment when it comes to protecting women in Yemen in general.
Thank you, Linda. Back to you, Nico. You mentioned in one of your previous reports that the international community should do everything in its power to secure the immediate release of these detainees. Based on your observations, how effective and serious has the international community's response been so far, and what additional actions they need to take to address this issue?
I mean, I think first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges we have in this situation is what we have in Yemen to begin with, which is that the world is not paying as much attention as they should be ever when it comes to abuses in Yemen. And I think with this situation, if we were talking about, dozens of international staff who had been detained, I think we would be in a really different situation right now than in a situation where it's all Yemeni nationals who've been detained. And I think that's one of the hardest things to really grasp about this situation when it comes to the international response. And it's also hard to understand how to get people to care as much as they need to be when it's the lives of all these, extremely hardworking people who've been an important part of Yemeni civil society for such a long time, who are all in detention. At the end of the day, when you have internationals in charge of a lot of the negotiations, they're the ones who are, in the lead on trying to advocate for their release. It's hard to really understand whether they are at the same point with the gravity of the situation when it comes to donor states, when it comes to UN agencies overall, et cetera. There seems to be a discrepancy between what Yemenis are feeling, even though obviously that's not one block either, and people have different opinions on the matter, and what I'm hearing from the international side of things. I think at the very least, what I am not seeing, I understand, the UN has been involved in negotiations from the beginning. They've been trying to advocate for the release of the detainees. They've tried various strategies. You know, I don't have all the specifics on all of that, and I can't be the judge of how effective a lot of that has been. But what I have seen is that people have not been released, and there hasn't been significant change up until a few days ago, when the UN finally stated we're cutting off operations in Saada for now, pausing it, I should say, not cutting off, in response to the detentions in Saada. And not being unable to assure the security of our staff there. What I'm confused about is the fact that that is true across all of Houthi-controlled territory at this point. Obviously, more people were detained in Saada. That's always been a tougher case for security with the UN there to begin with. There have been more detentions in the past in Saada than in other places. There's a stronger, you know, repression of freedoms there than there are in other places as well. But I don't understand why we're not also saying that security can't be assured in the rest of Houthi-controlled territory as well, and why there's a difference between those two things. So I think that's one question for me. I think the hard challenge is, and I'll acknowledge this, it's really challenging to know what to do in a situation where, you know, the vast majority of Yemenis, particularly in Houthi-controlled territory, require humanitarian aid for survival. Most people don't have access to adequate food or water, etc. And the UN has been quite integral in the process of being able to provide that food to people. But I think it's also very unclear what the UN is doing at this point to grapple with the fact that their staff are physically being detained for doing this type of work and for being associated with them. I think it's also, you know, years of the UN allowing certain contracts to be made and certain, they've provided certain leverages and assurances to the Houthis in order to continue their operations that have been trickled down into a situation where the Houthis have seen that they can have certain controls over the provisions of humanitarian aid. They've seen that they can tell UN agencies and INGOs, we demand X, Y, and Z. And even if you don't usually do that in other countries, you're going to do it here, and otherwise we're going to cut off your operations. And when, you know, you're in a situation where people see the humanitarian needs and don't see how they can grapple with those needs while at the same time managing these authorities, in many cases, they've gone ahead and allowed some of these situations to take hold. And so I think we're at a point today where it's very clear that that relationship needs to drastically change. And yet I think, you know, it's not my place as a human rights expert to say, you know, what humanitarian aid should be, what should be done with humanitarian aid. But what I do think you know, it is my place to say is that it doesn't seem that they're doing what they need to be doing. And it's also very clear to me that they're not being coordinated across, you know, the UN and INGOs and international donors and the international community in general. It needs to be a situation where people have come together and made a decision together. This is how we're going to grapple with the situation. This is what we're going to do for these staff. And it's been, you know, at this point, I'm trying to count numbers in my head right now. So 9 months, 8 months since these arrests began. And I still feel like people are unclear on a path forward. There's and that's where it's clear to me that things are not going well. You know, it's one thing for me to not have the expertise to be able to say, you all need to do X, Y, and Z. But what I can say is that is something that they need to have figured out, and they haven't figured it out yet. So, and I know, you know, it's a challenging situation. There's a lot of lack of clarity, but I don't even see, I think there's like a lack of coordination that's happening as well. And that's extremely worrisome when we're talking about the lives of a lot of people who are being arbitrarily detained and don't have the ability to speak up for themselves right now.
Well, these are really significant points, Nico. Back to you, Bara. We have seen how, like, the Houthis frequently use espionage allegations, as you say, as a tool against those working with embassies, international organizations, including UN staff and humanitarian workers. And they have even accused you of being a spy in their recent TV reports. Why do you think the Houthis rely so heavily on this narrative? What purpose does it serve for them politically and strategically?
The main, I mean, I think the main motive is quite simple. Is the message that they're trying to send is that they are under attack because of how regarding their foreign policy and how they approach specifically the United States and Israel. And for many years, this card, they tried to play it again and again. But due to the simple fact that the geographical distance between them and Israel is quite apparent, so they're not in an active conflict against Israel. But I think quite easy. This was the playbook that some of the other militias that they're trying to copy have done in other places. If you see what Hezbollah usually accuse the political rivals, or what they accuse human rights activists, and what they accuse civil society, what they say is those are Israeli spies, those are American spies, those do they're involved in espionage, as you mentioned. If you see the other militias in Iraq, they use exactly the same playbook. They repeat the same narrative. So what the Houthis had been trying to do for some time is saying we are only under attack because of our stance regarding the Palestinian issue. And since they got involved in attacking ships at the Red Sea, voicing support for the Palestinian cause, while our public and the international community are seeing horrific scenes inside Gaza, this card came up again. Now they are posing as the defenders of the Palestinian people, and now they can use the espionage card again. Again, I mean, I think it's an issue that they have tried. It's an accusation that they've tried to accuse especially civil society, especially journalists, especially activists, for quite a long time. But the timing couldn't be more convenient, that it happened while there is an ongoing conflict, an ongoing fight in Gaza. And if you're a Yemeni who not very politically engaged, but yet supportive of the Palestinian cause, like most of Yemenis are, this is you could buy that narrative. You could actually say, oh, now I get it. They are actually defending the Palestinian people, and there are many forces out there that are trying to undermine them, are trying to work against them.
Thank you, Bra. Linda, building on your point on international commitment, during your UN Security Council briefing last year, you addressed this issue, the issue of the UN staff being detained, among others. Based on your experience, how do you assess the stance of the international community on these detentions? Have there been any meaningful actions, or do you see a gap between statements and actual efforts to address this situation?
Basically, in my UN Security Council briefing, and also during bilateral meetings with the state members back in September 2024, I strongly urged the UN agencies and organizations to take a firm stand, but and also to demand the release, the immediate release of detainees. But also I asked them directly to publicly condemn this baseless espionage accusations. And I remember that the only state member that mentioned that during that session was the US. And that's what I have been repeating during that bilateral meetings, that we need to release the detainees, but also we need to emphasize also this espionage accusation, because it will harm more people, more activists, not only the UN staff and embassies employees. So for me, silence was not and still not an option. And I think that we need clear and decisive action, because it's not about the detainees. It's more about the humanitarian mission in Yemen in general. And I think that my briefing at the time, it wasn't a call for action, it was an absolute necessity. And with what happened yesterday and the death of the WFP employee, I think that this should mark a turning point. And this is no longer just a policy discussion. This is real life, lives lost. And I think this is also the failure to protect those who risks everything to help others. So in my opinion, this is a test of credibility of the UN resolution 2730 that it was adopted in May 2024. And in that resolution, the UN reaffirms that states must respect and protect humanitarian personnel under international law. It condemns attacks, detention, and calls for accountabilities. But here we are today. A humanitarian worker has died in detention yesterday, and others remain detained. And I think that we are forced to ask now this question: what is the value of this kind of UN resolution if we cannot hold it in practice? So the UN response so far, and maybe I will be more direct than you, Nico. I think that we have a strong language, but no real action. We have condemnations, but no impactful consequences. We have commitments, but we don't have enforcements. And this should change actually, because if not, we'll just have another resolution, another statement, and to dig further, I think that the problem is actually the gap. There is a gap between policy and reality. The policy is here, the UN security, the UN resolution, but the problem is the implementation. We don't have, states are urged to comply, but there's nothing required them to act. And I think that this will happen again and again, resolutions with strong wording, but without implementation. So I think that there's also the point that, in my opinion, if the UN withdraw without securing the release of detainees from some regions in Yemen, I think they are abandoning detainees. So I think that we should have a sustained, visible, and strong effort and to secure their release. And also, let me just remind you that this goes beyond Yemen. It's this. If we allow this to stand, we are risking humanitarian workers in other conflict zone. And I think the legitimate question here is, will the world respond with the same silence if this happens elsewhere?
Thank you, Linda. Nico, just yesterday, as you know, we followed the tragic death of Ahmed Ba'alawi, a WFP staff member who died while in detention in Sada. And the incident has sparked outrage and deep concern within the Yemenis and humanitarian community. From a human rights perspective, what does this case tell us about the risks humanitarian workers are facing, and what mechanisms exist to hold perpetrators accountable?
I mean, I think right now what it tells us from a human rights perspective to begin with, it really highlights the dire conditions we're talking about in Houthi detention. Oh no, am I frozen? No, I'm not frozen. Okay. Sorry, my internet's a bit shaky here sometimes. But I think to begin with, we don't understand the circumstances around his death. And yet that in itself is a problem. Why don't we know how he died? And why don't we know why several other people, including, former education staff, INGO staff, have been killed and, and have died in Houthi detention, possibly been killed over the last year? It's incredibly, it's terrifying that all of these people are dying and the families aren't allowed to even do an autopsy. There's no clarity around what's happened to begin with. I think one of the issues is when it comes to accountability. There's been so much advocacy for an accountability mechanism, an international investigative mechanism for years at this point to really be able to have some form of accountability for violations in the conflict. And yet previously, and this is because of the fact that within the context of Yemen, it's incredibly hard to have accountability. The country is still divided. It's still in conflict. You don't have a court system in which you can take violations that are happening by the Houthis in the north and pull them into the south. You can't take violations that have happened in the south into the north. And you can't even, we're not even talking about the broader conflict in this conversation, but how are you supposed to address the violations that have been committed by external countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, et cetera? How are you going to pull them into national courts? That's not even a possibility. So I think we do need to be talking about international accountability, and the options are frankly quite limited when it comes to Yemen. Previously, there was the Group of Eminent Experts, which was a UN mandated investigative mechanism that existed for 3 years, and the mandate had been renewed for 3 years. And, it's not like we're talking about the fact that they were able to suddenly come in and document the violations and immediately seek accountability, but they were documenting the violations, reporting on them on a yearly basis. And that's the necessary first step in order to actually have accountability in the future. And it's absolutely, it cannot be, overstated how important having that kind of mechanism is in a context like Yemen. And now, in 2021, Saudi and the UAE lobbied countries to vote against this mechanism. It was voted down at that UN Human Rights Council session. And since then, there has been nothing. And Saudi Arabia has ensured that every single proposal that would be on the table would be shot down to begin with. And so we're left in a situation where there is no current possibility of having an international mechanism to actually look into the violations in Yemen. The UN, which has, OHCHR, which is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, they previously at least had field monitors across the country who were documenting violations. And even if they weren't reporting on them to a significant degree, you at least had people who were monitoring things on the ground and had some understanding. Now, several of those individuals are in detention, and we're not seeing, again, the international community stand up in the way that it needs to. So we're really left in a pretty terrible situation when it comes to having any form of accountability until the international community does stand up. Of course, there's so many local processes, and I'm not trying to, say that those are not what's also important. That obviously is incredibly integral too, and Yemen has a very long and important history of local mediation processes and local accountability processes. But I think when it comes to something in which the international community is already involved, there's no extracting their involvement. They also need to be the ones standing up and making sure that they take responsibility to the extent that it needs to be taken and support justice efforts in Yemen in the way that it needs to be supported.
Thank you so much, Nico. Bara, despite the Houthis' continued violations, UN officials and diplomats continue to engage with them and even appease them, as many say. Based on your own experience in dialogue and negotiations, what lessons and best practices would you recommend to those negotiating with the Houthis? What leverage or diplomatic tools could be most effective in these engagements?
Yes. So the main issue when we deal with an international staff member, or you try to work with especially some policymakers or a diplomat or an international organization, is the main question that Nico was mentioning, was what is the solution? And then most often the question is, it's hard, it's difficult. You don't have one easy solution. This is what you're supposed to do. But I think that's the misconception that have happened, that it is the role of the international community to do a framework for the Yemenis. And I think that's not their role, and that's not what they're supposed to do. They can help in mediation, they can help in documentation, they can help in finding mechanisms, but it is upon of the Yemeni people. So the international actors, or like UN representatives, are supposed to give the Yemeni people the Yemeni civil society the tools and the means that they can take on their own cause. It is much more powerful that if the Yemenis speak on their own behalf and try to address the many challenges that they are facing. The second thing is there has been an issue for quite a long time of how the conflict has been framed since the beginning. If the framing of the conflict that this is just a Saudi attack on Yemen that started in March 2015, then the solution by default is just if the Saudis, like they're doing right now, engage with the Houthis, the problem is resolved, which is not the case. It is much more complicated than that. And the only people who can break down that complexity is the Yemenis, are the Yemeni civil society actors, and many of them were forced to leave the country. And I think that's the second question is, many of the INGOs who have been working should have been asking this question right from the start. Why are the majority of Yemeni civil society unable to return to Sana'a? Why are they not working from inside the country? And the question quite simple. The majority are fleeing from the Houthis. And I say this as a person who have documented and worked on a violation that happened in the south, in Aden, in Mukalla, and other places. So if you try to work the issue of the issue of the detainees in Aden, you do the same. You try to find local lawyers, human rights workers, human rights lawyers, and give them the platform to actually push for the solutions that they see fit. The third thing I think, which is very, very important, is the international community had dealt with this with the Houthis not from the point of leverage. It's the Houthis who need this support at this critical moment, and if they're not willing to facilitate that, they need to be forthcoming and honest. Part of their role is to reflect the honesty, the reality on the ground to the international community, and say it is the Houthis who are preventing us from doing humanitarian work. We would like to continue, we would like to deliver aid, but actually we cannot work under these conditions. If our staff are being intimidated and harassed, it basically impedes our efforts. It affects our ability to continue working inside Yemen. You'd hear meetings, and you see meetings from UN representatives meeting senior Houthi officials and pleading with them to. It's like the unrealization of you have the leverage. It's not supposed to be the way that you are requesting for them to allow you to deliver humanitarian aid. And if they're not willing to, I might be a little bit radical in my approach, but I would say divert the aid to other places until they're willing to engage. Finally, the last point I would like to make here is there isn't one simple solution of how you approach such a difficult issue, but very clearly, if you try to appease the Houthis every time they escalate in their demands, they're gonna detain more next time and then demand something more. I've heard, and if you follow Houthi media outlets, they have been saying for many months, even prior to this, that they would like to have control over the humanitarian activities. They want the funding to go directly to this entity that they have created that controls or oversee the humanitarian aid work. And one way, if they continue to intimidate and harass UN staff, and it's because we ignored the many years of the history they have of many years of intimidation, harassment, blackmailing, and coercion on the civil society, on the activists, on journalists, and so on. Now we are reaching to UN staff members.
Thank you, Bara. And now let's take some questions from our audience. We have received some great ones, and I will direct them to our panelists. We have a question and a point from Shuruq Al-Qasimi. She said, one thing I don't understand is why UN agencies are acting so shockingly slow. The Houthis have always followed this policy toward national and foreign activists, as well as humanitarian workers. The only difference now is scale. So my question is, why haven't these agencies relocated their operations to non-Houthi controlled areas? The Houthis, but even in Houthi controlled areas, aid rarely reaches those who need it. The Houthi loot it, withhold it from the vulnerable, and sometimes even sell it back. Linda, would you like to take this one?
Yes. Actually, Shuruq, the real challenge here is how we hold the Houthi accountable without punishing the people who need aid and assistance. This is the main challenge. So I think the solution, or if we have recommendation to give, is we need diplomatic pressure. We need to secure the immediate release of detained and aid workers in Houthi prisons. We need legal mechanism also to ensure those responsible are held accountable. And we need protection policies to prevent aid workers from being used as bargaining tactics. But let me go back to the Houthi group, that designation, the FTO, or designation of Houthi as a foreign terrorist organization. I think that the real question now, we have this sanction, or does this change anything, or is it enough? I think that legally speaking, it enables stronger actions, and there is sanctions and legal measures, but it also complicates humanitarian aid. So I think this is so critical. Shuruq question is not easy, because this is where the UN is failing, I guess, to have a balance. How to help detained people, to help with their release, but also how to help Yemeni under Houthi controlled areas. So there is no solution so far. And I want also to comment on what Bara said. He said that we rely a lot on the international community, and it's a very sad reality, actually. And it's because we cannot rely on the government, because there is no political will, and we cannot rely on civil society organizations because of the lack of resources. So we go back to the international community, not because we believe that they will be they will provide the real solution, but because we don't have another choice so far.
Yeah, Nico, what's your take on this?
Honestly, Shuruq, I have a lot of the same questions. I think I'll say this much. The Houthis obviously do divert a lot of aid. I think everyone is well aware of that fact for a long time. But I think WFP had basically cut off their aid for a period of time because of this aid diversion in 2023. And then they restarted providing aid under a pilot program where they basically had further control over who the aid was being provided to, the list of beneficiaries, et cetera. So all this is to say, I honestly think that there's a lot that unfortunately we should know more about, and we don't know enough about. There's a lack of transparency, and I think that's a major issue right now, because I think a lot of us don't have enough details about how much aid is actually being diverted, how much isn't being diverted. I would hope that there's not such a significant portion of aid being diverted, but honestly, I don't think we know enough. There has not been enough data to really demonstrate how much is and how much isn't, and I think there's a major lack of transparency there. So I all that's to say, you know, in conversations that humanitarian aid organizations have had with us, they've made extremely clear that their aid is absolutely necessary in order to sustain life. And it's very hard to understand, you know, what are the realities of the beneficiary? What is the situation on the ground? Because there's an extreme lack of data collection. There's an extreme lack of ability to really divulge what, you know, what's going to who, how are they making those decisions? you know, what exactly is happening. And so I think it makes it quite suspicious for the rest of us who are watching what's happening, and it's really unclear why are they continuing to do this in a context in which people are being arrested. So all that's to say, a lot of murkiness there.
Bara, let me direct this question from Firas Hamdouni to you. Do you think tribal and religious leaders who have influence over the Houthis may be able to mediate progress? Do you think Iran could be leveraged as a potential pressure point?
Short answer, no. But it's a little bit more complicated than this. The real decision-making circle is around Abd al-Malik al-Houthi. And a huge part of why the Houthis' governing structure have been very ineffective and in total mess, to be honest, is because Abd al-Malik al-Houthi has never stood foot in Sana'a. He rules from Sada, relying on advice of within his close circle. And it takes it takes a lot for people to meet him in person. So it is not the traditional I would say tribal and political circles or the traditional tribal and political actors who in the past at least you had access to them. If things got complicated, you can reach to the person in charge, and you can speak with them. The tribal dynamics is different under the Houthis. Many of the people who used to advise the Houthis, even when I was still at the National Dialogue, many of the Houthi representatives had now been sidelined. They've been silenced by the Houthis. They've been pressured to stay quiet because of the fact of how much the power dynamics is very concentrated around Abd al-Malik al-Houthi. The second thing I think, which I think would give result, is it is time for the international community to think of pressure. And the FTO is one way to do it. Now, the FTO is not a magic solution. It's still, even if you saw the decision, it still requires many steps of how that will be, be implemented. But I think it is time to start applying real pressure on the Houthis. My main fear has been since the beginning of the conflict. I spent the first years of the conflict pleading with humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, to cover, for example, the issue of the siege on Taz. The main fear I had is a situation like this, where we have a situation where the Houthis come on a political scene that they're comfortable to act without being held accountable. It takes time until that pressure actually comes fruits to concrete results. But you try to use the tools that you have right now. For me, since the first designation, I think that should have continued. We would have been at a very different situation today if that had continued since the end of 2020 or 2021. And again, I think it is time to apply pressure, and to apply pressure seriously, to expose the Houthis for what they are. And again, my concern is it is time for the international representatives to leave the space for the Yemeni civil society to act. They are at the best place to break down that complexity when people try to understand what is happening on the ground, who are the Houthis, and how do you engage and engage effectively with them.
Yes, another point from one of our audience saying, while the situation about detaining of civil society and journalists is clear, and the Houthi rationale of doing this is clear, arresting and detaining the staff responsible for these activities is completely counterproductive for the Houthis. So I really would like to hear the panel members' views about this aspect of the situation. He said also detainees of these people goes against the interest of the Houthis, who want the UN to maintain and even increase humanitarian aid food distributions. Linda, any insights on this?
Yes, this is like a basic question actually, because if this kind of act is harming them, why they are doing it? This is the main question actually. And I think that's why they add the espionage mark. It's for them to go with this victim narrative that they are like attacked, even internally by journalists and by activists. But I think, as I said earlier, it's a bargaining tactics. It's when it comes to negotiation, they can use this card as for a transaction. I'm sorry to say this like this, but this is a reality. Sometimes it happened during the prisoners and detainees swap with the ICRC and with the OSSG office. The government representative said to us clearly when we asked why women are not added to the list, the detained women, why they are not added to their list for this negotiation, for the release and the swap. And he said that it's not good for Yemeni women to be added to the list because it's a transaction. So to answer this question, you should know that we don't share the same mentality with the Houthi. They are looking for their interest, despite what this could cause them, like a reputation, or if it will damage their reputation. What they seek is their interest at the end, and they could put some marks from time to time just to justify their acts.
Yeah, Nico, let me transfer this point from Pierre Flavier to you, because you touch upon these points in your previous reports. He said the humanitarian assistance cannot be conditioned to political issues. It must follow humanitarian principles. This is why you cannot withdraw needed aid in Houthi-controlled areas.
Yes, well, I'm Pierre, if I'm not mistaken, was previously the UN
Yes.
resident coordinator.
Thank you.
So he,
Yeah.
can you hear
I hear
me?
now.
Okay. So yeah, he would know this obviously quite well. But I mean, that is correct. You can't, I think the point here is that you can't use humanitarian assistance as leverage. You can't say according to UN and humanitarian principles, you can't say we are not going to provide aid because we want you to release the detainees. But I think what can be investigated is this question of do no harm, which is a major principle in humanitarian assistance. And is the UN doing more harm by, providing certain contracts and allowing certain aid diversion and having, had a relationship with the Houthis over the year that might in fact be harming civilians in several different ways, right? And contributing to a military effort. So I think to me, that's the question that needs to be, pulled apart by the UN, and understanding what that looks like for their relationship to have become what it is with the Houthis, and for the Houthis to now be taking advantage of that. And then also really quickly, I wanted to just build on what Linda had said about, their reasoning behind detaining different people and why they would hurt their own interests in that way. And I do just want to flag that a lot of the people that they detained were not those who were directly providing aid for the most part, but it was, often the human rights people, with OHCHR. And then it was people who were in charge of dealing with education, because the Houthis have tried to gain full control over the education system and the materials that are being, taught in schools. And then I think first and foremost, in relation to what just happened with the WFP and all of these arrests that we just saw in January, it's a lot of people who have control and information over data. Control over data and just broader information about operations. It was a lot of IT people, IT engineers who were arrested that day. And so I think there has been a very clear, line from the Houthis from the beginning. And that has been one of the biggest issues with the UN, is them saying, we want to control the data. We don't want you to have the data. We don't want you to have the beneficiary list. We don't want you to be able to do research to better understand, what do normal humanitarian needs assessments. They really have taken issue with this for many years, and there's been a lot of concessions made from the UN on what the Houthis would allow them to do, what they wouldn't allow them to do, et cetera. And there's a clear trend in the fact that a lot of the people that they're detaining are those individuals who do have a lot of access to information in a way that, is something that they've gone after to begin with.
Thank you, Nico. We have also a question from Sofiane Assar. He's asking how the FTO designation will impact operations of Sana'a Airport. And Bara, let me elaborate on this and ask about how the FTO designation will impact the overall humanitarian operations in Yemen.
Let me try to address this in a different way. The humanitarian crises in Yemen will not be alleviated until the conflict is over, and you will not have a real process of actual humanitarian flow of aid normally flowing into the country while the Houthis are in charge in the way they are. So the main problem is in many of the discussions we have is that we run back in circles. If you do apply pressure, then they're going to cut aid. But if you don't, then they enjoy leverage on humanitarian agencies and operate accordingly. The humanitarian crisis doesn't come out of a vacuum. It is there is a root cause, and the root cause is there has been systematic failure of enhancing. At the end of the day, in any country, no country can rely on humanitarian aid. You need functioning state institutions operating normally, and the many efforts with the Houthis to engage with them to reinstate a framework in which that can happen, that has constantly failed. So the FTO has to come into effect specifically for that reason, because if you care about alleviating humanitarian suffering on the long run, then you need to operate. You need to find means of pressure that will prevent them or stop them acting in such way. The last time when they got removed from the designation, they didn't concede on anything. You could have easily pressured them to release detainees. You could have easily asked them to allow the flow of humanitarian aid in exchange, make something transactional in exchange for removing the designation list. But unfortunately, the Biden administration at the time decided that they were just going to remove them. A similar time when the former UN envoy to Yemen was brokering the deal of Hudaydah. He flew into Sana'a, took 500 Houthi fighters, get them abroad to get medical recovery and medical attention. He didn't, in exchange, even request the release of one journalist. Not even one journalist got released because of that mediation. If you're a mediator and you're ignoring this, and this is a problem that has been ongoing. Again, this didn't start just last year. This has been ongoing. And if you have detainees coming out of prison, while some of them are paralyzed, have permanent disabilities, many of them are being killed, then that should also put a real concern about what is the future of those detainees. And now we saw someone just yesterday losing his life in a UN staffer who lost his life inside prison. So caring about the humanitarian suffering should be a little bit have a more broader vision than just this immediate thinking of if we transactional. If we put pressure, then they're going to block humanitarian aid. The humanitarian aid is there is a root cause for that.
Yeah, I would like also to hear from Linda and Nico about this FTO redesignation issue and how could impact the humanitarian situation on the ground, and how could Houthis use this also to further escalate their violations against Yemenis. Linda, you have the floor.
as I have said earlier, this FTO designation will have impacts. Legally, it will affect Houthis. Politically, also, they will be forced to go back to negotiations. But humanitarily speaking, it will affect people who are under their control. So this is also the main question right now: is how this FTO sanctions will be implemented. And how they will balance this, not harming people, Yemeni people there. So I think that this also, I can relate this to the UN resolution itself. It's different, but also it's another mechanism. I think that this FTO thing and the UN resolution related to the release of detainees, we are having like a test of the international system credibility, actually. And I think that what we need is a collective responsibility. We need the member state not to endorse this kind of sanctions, the FTO, the UN resolution. We need them also to enforce them. We need like implementation mechanism. We need to know how they will implement it, not only to designation is something, but also I think that implementation is something else. So I think we don't have the answer yet to this, because we are waiting to see how this will be implemented actually.
Nico, any additional words on this issue?
Honestly, I think nothing to add to what my colleagues have already stated. I think there's no chance it won't cause further harm. And it's still unclear what we're going to see from it at this point.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been a deeply insightful conversation. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask each of you to share one key takeaway for our audience and to stakeholders also. If there's one critical point you would like to raise, what would it be? Nico?
First pick for bringing up the most critical point. Honestly, I hear everyone on what they're saying about the importance of this, movements from here on out needing to come and be directed by Yemeni civil society. I think this is critical. And I think when it comes to what needs to happen on the detentions, there needs to be immense international involvement, because all of it involves international institutions, but it should be led by Yemenis and Yemeni civil society. It should be led by expertise and people who actually understand how the Houthis have functioned for a very long time in the history, and who are following them and who have a more in-depth understanding of what's happening there. So I think to me, it's a two-edged thing. It needs more international attention. It needs the international community to actually take real action and come together and deal with this, rather than allowing it to be an afterthought after everything else that's happening in the region. But simultaneously, it needs to be led by local efforts and be taken forward in that way, as should, everything in Yemen at this point.
Over to you, Barak.
I think I second what Nico just mentioned, and what also Linda mentioned before that. The main take point that I want people to understand is this is a new phenomena that did actually rise with the Houthis. We didn't have that great record of human rights in Yemen, yes, but we didn't have normally people being arbitrarily detained, being tortured, people die in prison, and people go out, leave prison with permanent disabilities. This is a new phenomena, and I think it is important for people to understand that. I've worked on Yemen. I've represented detainees, journalists who sometimes were being harassed by the authorities. It was never like this. This is the level of intimidation, blackmailing of families, and then the abuses that just happen inside Houthi detention facilities it has never been like this in Yemen. So I think that's the main thing that I want people to understand, from this to the detention of women and so on.
And let's conclude with you, Linda.
First, thank you for organizing this timely panel, actually. I think that this is not about Yemen. it's not only about Yemen, it's about every humanitarian worker in every conflict zone and who risk their life to protect others. And our discussion today is not about politics, it's about humanity. And I echo what Barak said, that we need diplomatic pressures and that humanitarian aid is not a crime. And we cannot wait until another name is added to the list of those who have been disappeared, detained, or died in the Houthi prisons. It's time, if there is, my last message is, it's time to move beyond condemnation and into real enforceable action.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists, Nico, Bara, and Linda, for sharing your expertise today. And a big thank you to our audience for engaging in this discussion. We know these issues are complex, but raising awareness and proposing solutions is a significant step forward. We'll be sharing a recording of this session along with key takeaways and resources. If you have more questions or want to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out. Once again, thank you all for being part of this discussion. Take care, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Thank you.